Welcome back to another episode of Conspiratus. I'm here again, and look who finally showed up.
Hello. Glad to be back.
Where,
Super excited to be here.
where have you been?
I've been out and about for a while. I traveled a bit. I stayed with some friends for a while, and I've mostly not been working on crypto, actually. I've been working on unrelated passion projects, version control stuff, I'll say.
Ooh, cool. Are you ready to talk about that publicly, or is it under the wraps right now?
Under the wraps for now, but it all will be open source, of course. I promise. Don't hate me, open source world. But it would all be open if I wasn't so bad at writing software, and it's just embarrassing.
Why is there such a taboo? Why is there such a taboo against closed source software? I feel like, I feel open source software has become a little bit too much of a religion, such that it ignores reality and incentives of
Totally. My friend, I heard a really actually interesting point about open source and how people over evangelize it in certain cases. Like Elon Musk sometimes makes points about how AI, all AI breakthroughs should be open source. And wouldn't it be horrible if the big corporations controlled all of it? And the person made a competing point, which is if we said that about nuclear weapons, imagine we were like, all nuclear weapons should be open source. Everyone would probably be like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't do that,
Yeah.
So.
Well, I was talking more about I should be able to monetize code that I write and not have to open source it. That seems reasonable. I feel for blockchains maybe, but I think other stuff it totally makes sense to be allowed. It shouldn't. I feel you should want to open source stuff because you want to, and But it's not I feel there shouldn't be this stigma against not open sourcing.
Yeah, certainly not in every industry. It definitely doesn't make sense for everything. It feels like if we force people to open source everything that they do, if we really adopt that culture, then what we're going to do is just stop people from making software because they're not going to get paid for it. You know what I mean? Which is not a good outcome in any case. So, what have you been up to the past summer?
Working on a bunch of different stuff. I was in Berlin for most of the summer. I just got
trendy.
I just got back to the Bay Area yesterday. I love Berlin. And I was kind of working on different stuff, some DEX stuff, staking derivatives. I wrote up a good spec for how to do proper fungible staking derivatives.
Oh, interesting. What does that mean?
You're gonna hate this. You're gonna freak out.
It sounds kind of scary. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. I bond tokens for staking, and then I get these derivatives that I can then resell and trade bonded tokens.
Sure. The concern I've always had with those is that there's these weird games that validators could start playing about. Imagine I'm a validator. I bond my tokens. I get my staking derivatives. I sell them off to people. And then I say, hey, everyone, I'm going to equivocate. And my token crashes to the ground. And then I buy them back and I don't equivocate. The point is, it seems like it introduces very strange incentives for validators about what they tell people and what they do that aren't immediately obvious. It seems like you also can't stop people from doing this. So what are you going to do?
Yeah. The reason these exist is I don't like them, but Poloniex started allowing people to trade on all the atoms that they have on their exchange are staked, and they're giving people rewards on the atoms that are in their account.
Oh, wow.
And so it's okay, oh, well, shit. If they can do it, then we should make it so anyone can do it in a trustless manner.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Because otherwise it's why would I not go to Poloniex to delegate?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it makes for a good, there's also a DeFi argument for it as well, which is here's this giant pool of capital that, there's a thing, I forgot what the term is called, super
salad.
No, it was super collateralization or something where it's the same collateral as backing many, many things. And
that's crazy.
Yeah,
that sounds terrifying. You're right. You got me. That was the word.
Yeah. And so what if I use my staking derivatives to as collateral in a CDP to create a stable coin?
Jeez, my God. Oh my God.
But it's a basket of many stable staking derivatives from different validators.
Sure. No, we definitely agree that an asset that's devoted to a single like if the staking is necessary, right? If it's for some security or stablecoin purpose, then like doing it for multiple ones, it decreases the relative security that any individual thing gets, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it might be the case that the increase, like the net utility of being able to use these for multiple things outweighs the security decrease that any individual one gets, or even in summation. So it might be good, but I'd love to like see a more in-depth argument that this is actually reasonable and not just like totally horrifying and it's like the scariest thing I've ever heard in my life.
I think most of the DeFi space is terribly horrifying and some of the worst things I've ever heard.
Really?
Yeah,
that's really interesting. But you are pro DeFi, like as.
I'm in this phase, right? So I think what the DeFi space is missing right now is notions of reputation, where I think that here's the classic example. It's Lightning versus Interledger. Lightning approaches the world saying there is no trust in the world whatsoever. And so if I want to send you 1 cent, we got to go through this complex cryptographic game because I don't want you stealing my 1 cent, man. While Interledger says, look, okay, maybe me and you don't trust each other, but we both trust Bob, and Bob trusts you, and can we figure out how to transmit a payment through Bob into you? And it's basically saying, I think there is an existing fabric of trust that exists in the world. And the goal should not be to build trustless systems. The goal should be to build systems that use technology to leverage existing trust relationships.
Yeah, no. I think you're totally right that like existing DeFi stuff in no way like uses identity in any meaningful sense. There's like no use of identity, including reputation. And there totally could be.
Yeah, and I think until we build that, like we're not going to build an actual financial system because that's just not how finance works.
Yeah, fair point. Interesting. Do you think that DeFi is the end all be all of blockchain use cases? Because I recently, while talking to Dan Robinson, he made the point that he thinks that like DeFi is not only the use case now, but it's the use case going forward. Like this is what blockchains are useful for. Do you agree with that?
Okay, maybe, but remember a couple podcasts ago I said there was a couple use cases. There was like DeFi, name services, DAOs, and something else.
Sure.
What it was.
Okay, fair. Yeah.
Let's, I guess at some point I want to come back to that and discuss that. Let's talk about the DeFi one. Dan thinks that, he's made the claim that ETH is money because it's the basis of DeFi. So I guess the other thing I've been doing this summer is I've been spending a lot more time learning a lot more monetary theory and monetary policy. And dude, what the hell are we doing in this blockchain space? Bitcoin isn't money. Ethereum isn't money. This stuff is all
God.
Like BS. Did
you become a fiat shill this summer? Is that what happened?
I am a fiat apologist or a fiat shill. And it's like this stuff is it just makes so much more sense. Like the world is the way it is right now for a reason. And it's like there were steps that we took that were like we moved away from like a gold standard and stuff and towards this world that we live in with fiat for a reason. And there's missteps that we took because of maybe misaligned incentives. But I think on the net, we were moving in the right direction.
Interesting. Okay, so let's like break it down. So the question, the fundamental question here essentially is like cryptocurrency, and when we say cryptocurrency now, let's just talk about Ethereum and Bitcoin, like Ether and Bitcoin specifically, not all these fancy stable coins built on top of them, right? Is Ethereum and Bitcoin money? So there's a couple of questions here. The first one is what is money in the first place? What does that even mean? The second one is, why is this argument important and or relevant, right? Like, why do we care if these things are money? Like if they're being used in interesting ways, right? So first of all, what makes you say that they're not money in a meaningful sense? I, in some sense, agree with you, but I want to hear what you think. And also then let's talk about, why it even matters to have this discussion.
When I say they're not money, they're not good money. I made a poll on Twitter the other day asking, Eric Connor, he had a poll saying like, is ETH money? And he had like 2 options, yes and yes. and try to pull like, are bananas money? Yes or yes? I don't know. So I can call anything I want money. But look, these sick ass stickers right now. We can trade these, and these can be money.
I want one.
Yeah, but how about good money? Let's talk about what's good money. And I think one of the main things you want for money, of the value of the things you want, store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account. Especially for unit of account, you need stability, right?
Yeah.
And I think that all the current cryptocurrencies take this approach where where we have fixed supply in the case of Bitcoin or in the case of Ethereum. I think Ethereum is slowly becoming more and more Bitcoin-like over time. And it's, minimal, absolutely minimal issuance possible. Like they want to get it down to like 0.001% or so, I don't know, something crazy like that. And so here's the fundamental thing. If there's demand for money and there's a change in demand for money, you want the supply of money to also be elastic so that changes in demand for money can be met with changes in supply for money, and the price of money stays close to stable.
So let me see if I understand. So the point here is that for something to be an effective unit of account, it can't be extremely volatile. Like obviously Bitcoin isn't a very good unit of account, right? When you think about your Bitcoin portfolio, you might, it's not super meaningful to just think about it in terms of Bitcoin because it doesn't really relate to the real world. And so we need stability. And your point here is that to get stability, we need a supply that can change as demand does. We need supply that can meet demand.
That at first of all, somewhat responsive.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So that seems true, at least in like standard. I mean, and I only have ever taken like, Econ 101. So at least in my Econ 101 models, it seems like the only way we can affect price is supply and demand. And so I believe you. But I guess the question becomes now, you're not necessarily arguing that like some institution like the Fed should be determining that rather than a protocol in some sense, right?
Do you actually know the origins of the Fed? Like why the Fed was created?
No, I don't.
Okay, let me tell you what the origin of the Fed was.
Woo! Oh my God. Sorry, pause real quick. You totally are a fiat chill. Like no other. I mean, this is maximum fiat chilling right here.
Yes. Okay, so basically, during the Civil War, the U.S. went off like the gold standard completely, and we basically started printing these things called greenbacks, which had like no backing whatsoever, and they just said this is legal tender on it. Everyone hated it, and we went back, in around 1870s or early 80s, I think we finally got rid of all the greenbacks. And here's the thing. In monetary policy, what you're trying to do is there's two things. There's discipline and elasticity, and you're trying to balance these two systems, right? And so there was a backlash to the greenbacks. And so we went in a very disciplinary system where we had a system called the National Banking System, which basically said, look, there's going to be a bunch of New York banks that are in New York, and they need to have a reserve requirement, let's say 25%. They need to have 25% reserves in gold, and their outstanding deposits have to be backed by 25% reserves in gold. Then you have like these state banks throughout the country, which have to have 25% reserves as well, but their reserves can be as deposits in the New York banks.
Interesting. Okay.
And then the country banks, these like small, tiny banks out all over the countryside and everything, they also have to have 25% reserves. But their reserves they can be deposits in the state banks.
Cool. Nice.
Now, what would happen is once a year, all the farmers around harvest time suddenly need money in order to buy new equipment, farm equipment, or pay labor, or the things you need to do. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know, but they have stuff to do, stuff to buy at harvest time.
That's the hole in your knowledge for sure.
Yeah. And so what do? They need to pull out a bunch of money. And so they go to the country banks. The country banks, their reserves dip below their outstanding deposits. And so then, they need to pull more money from the state banks, which then you need to go pull more money from the New York banks. At the New York bank, they're like, oh, okay, we don't have any more deposit. We don't, there's a limited amount of gold. So, we have to shift our deposits. And so, a lot of their deposits throughout the year are loans to Wall Street speculators. And the Wall Street speculator, around harvest, what they have to do is they have to call in all those short-term loans so that they can, give money to the state banks that have deposits in them so the farmers can get it eventually. And all the Wall Street speculators around harvest time, because of this, they have to liquidate their positions. And so they can come up with the money to pay back the bank. And every year the stock market would crash because everyone's liquidating their positions in order to pay back the system. And you had this giant crash in asset prices annually.
So effectively what we have here is, as a result of this, in this case, cyclic, but change in demand to demand for money, because there was this very cyclic change in demand for money, and the supply wasn't reacting appropriately. You got massive fluctuations in the price for money, which is detrimental to the whole economy.
So here's, basically because, the asset prices crash, that can also be seen as a rise in price of money, right? Here's what the Federal Reserve was designed to solve. The Fed said, the Fed is a bottom-up system, not a top-down system. The Federal Reserve System was designed so that any bank can go ahead. So a country bank, if someone needs money, any bank can create money out and use a 2% loan as collateral for creating money. So farmer comes to the country bank and says, I need money. They said, okay, the bank will, here, you swap these IOUs, the IOU from the bank to the farmer is a deposit, while the farmer to the bank is a 2% loan. And then the country banks, if they need to, they can go ahead and do what's called discounting the loan, which they can go to a higher level bank and say, okay, look, we'll give you this bank in order for deposits in your account, and we'll give you this loan. And then the higher level banks and then go to the Federal Reserve and the central bank and do something what's called a rediscount. You can rediscount the loan and get, and so that way you can send it up to the Fed if needed. And so what's happening here is any bank, it's a bottom-up system where any bank can, basically, the Federal Reserve was designed to allow money to be collateralized by loans to Main Street and to farmers. So that way, the actual lifeblood of the economy, as the demand for money changes, the banking system can change the supply of money because the money is backed by loans to Main Street, which is
So the
demand.
The point here that you're making when you say bottom up is that the money is essentially created where it needs to be created. It's essentially it's made from these loans in the places that these loans are taken out, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. That's really interesting. Wow.
But you know what happened?
Oh no. Oh my God.
Yeah.
If this ends with me being a fiat chill also, this is gonna be a sad podcast. I'll tell you that.
It may take more than a podcast, but I'll get there. 9 months into the system, what happened? Oh, oops! We entered World War I, or we didn't enter World War I, but World War I started, and we decided to bankroll the entire allies. And a couple of 2 years in, we entered World War I, and the government is like, "Hey, Federal Reserve, you know how we said you can create money backed by only by loans to Main Street and stuff? Actually, JK, you're going to take all these treasury bills instead, and you're going to use that for collateral and give money to the government because we need to go fight this war thing that we're doing over here." And come the end of World War I, the entire Federal Reserve System was chock full of treasury bills, and they were just unable to remove it from the balance sheet after that because it was just so full of it, and that just became the basis of the money system. But that's not what it was designed to do. The Federal Reserve was not designed to be a central bank for the government. It was designed to be a central bank for the people.
Wow, that's crazy. That's really shocking. So, very interesting overview of the Fed. I think I'm definitely going to end up being a fiat chill by the end of this if I'm not careful. But so it seems like, the origins of the Fed. There's a lot here. But so my first question is, okay, so it seems like the initial motivation / design of the Fed makes reasonable sense in terms of controlling the money supply and meeting demand where it needs to be met. And my question to you is, so the first thing is, it's obvious that Bitcoin and Ethereum definitely don't do this in any meaningful sense. So the first question is, are there stable coins currently that have any meaningful notion of that? And second of all, it seems like it doesn't, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, it doesn't just have to be the Fed that does something like this. Like, we could design a system that tries to do this and serves as currency. Like, we could create a currency of our own that happens to be a crypto, right? If it doesn't exist yet.
Yes. And so what I'm saying here is not that this entire space is doomed. I'm saying that our current notions of the value of cryptocurrency are misguided, and probably, I think that the people in the crypto space, or the vast majority, don't have enough understanding of economics and just learning of the past. And so, I think there are new systems that we can design that might be better. That's what I've been thinking through. By the way, DAI is not the answer. DAI is just this thing that's over collateralized by ETH. So, why the hell would anyone want to over collateralize in order to create this thing? DAI only works while ETH's price. Wait, is there any piece of DeFi that doesn't currently depend on number go up of ETH?
I'm really not sure. The over collateralization thing to me makes no sense at all. It seems like the only reason that is the case is because there's not an efficient market for Ether that exists yet, right? But that's not going to be the case long term. So so it seems crazy to me.
So DAI is definitely not the long term solution. That thing can't ever hit scale. So what can we create? I'm open to ideas there's a project called Terra in Cosmos, which is, it's like, imagine Maker, but instead of collateralizing using a third asset like ETH, you collateralize using the MKR itself. It's wacky. It's like, I don't know how this thing even makes sense, but at least you're trying something new. And so essentially, I don't think these collateralized systems work. I think we need to create, we have to create a self-standing system. There's a project called From Definity. Dominic Williams gave a talk about it, I think at DevCon 1 or something. It's called Phi. If you search for it on the internet, all you can find is one PDF, slide.
I think I've read it. Yeah, I think I've seen it.
Yeah, that's what we need to do. We need to that was exactly the entire idea. He's like, okay, look, we can create a bank that's allowed to create deposits using loans to people.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, because we've talked about this a little bit before, and from the little I've read about it, it seems like there's this Hayekian notion of things other than the government creating money, and then this competitive marketplace for money essentially being created, where there's a bunch of different monies, and the best monies win out is the dream. Yeah. And so it seems like we definitely could design protocols that in many ways served the purpose that the Fed did initially. Like, something you brought up before is Phi, which is an old Definity project that doesn't really exist on the internet anymore, but it's something kind of very similar, where we have loans being created where they're needed, and that's how new money gets issued in a way that the Fed, maybe was originally envisioned to be created. So do you see protocols that exist currently that kind of fit this purpose well? And in the future, do you think there are going to be a lot of protocols that have different ways of creating money, and in terms, different implementations of what money are? And do you think these things are going to compete with each other going forward?
So I think there is. So DAI is not the answer. And
what makes you say that?
I think the over collateralization doesn't make sense. That's really what you can't make a money system that's depending on this other asset to be over collateralizing everything. Otherwise, then that other asset just becomes the you have to expect that that asset to be more valuable than the money system as a whole. Even when we had the gold standard, we still always had like fractional reserve. Like, there's in the entire history of like I said, in the story of the central banking system, even in that pretty disciplinary system, it was still fractional reserve. We allowed the money system to be larger in value than the gold underlying it. And so, expecting a system to work with over collateralization is not long-term feasible. I think that's like even more disciplinary than this system that already broke.
Yeah. What's interesting also is that I've heard the gold standard described as something that makes this, disciplinariness easy. Like, it's a way, enforcing the gold standard is one effective way of forcing the government to not print a bunch of money, right? It allows this disciplinary action, but I wonder if that's something that we don't need to collateralize in the same way, because we can do that in protocol now as compared to, through the gold standard.
Yeah, I mean, the gold standard was a way of allowing the gold standard was really only important for international trade purposes, right? Where if you do want to pay someone in the United States, you pay them in dollars. But when you wanted to pay someone in England, you had to pay them in gold, because they were not going to accept dollars. And this is actually why the gold standard fell apart during the Civil War. Why we went to the greenback, because what happened was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Salmon P. Chase, he basically went to the banks and struck them a deal saying, hey, can you please take all these government bonds and give us a bunch of deposits in your bank, so that way we can, we need to fund this war effort. We don't, you want us to lose this war? And the banks are like, okay, fine. And then as soon as he gets a bunch of deposits, he turns around immediately and says, okay, I'd like to convert these all to gold now, please. And he basically drains the entire banking system of all of its gold. And basically, because he wanted that gold in order to be able to go buy war materials from Britain. And so now the banking system's like, fuck, we don't have any more gold anymore. So then that's when they decide to start, they create the greenbacks, where they're like, okay, well, this is money because we said it's money now.
That's the dream. It's the future of the world.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, where do you consume all this information about? Like, where are you learning all this history stuff?
Yeah. So remember that course I talked about that I was taking in that first, I talked about in that first episode,
Sure.
Or first episode when we came back. That course, Economics of Money and Banking. It's on Coursera by Perry Merling. He's a professor at Columbia.
Wow.
Great course. I just finished it a couple of weeks ago. So that's probably a lot of it. I've also been reading a book right now called The Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World. It's about the central bankers between the world wars and how their insistence to remain on the gold standard led to the Great Depression and Nazism and all that fun stuff.
Wow.
And it's funny because I often see Bitcoiners be pointing to this book and be like, "Hey, look, this shows how terrible central bankers are." And it's like, yes, I agree with you, but the terribleness of them was their insistence of this religious belief in the gold standard. And it's I don't know if you want to be pointing to that as your best example, guys.
They read the title and they didn't read any deeper, and that's what they got.
Yeah, they didn't actually bother reading how they broke the system.
That's crazy. Well, that's amazing. I definitely should check this out.
I think have you heard of this thing called Rodrik's Trilemma?
No.
Okay, so Rodrik's Trilemma is you can look it up. It's great. I tweeted this a few days ago where I'm like, this is the real trilemma we should be thinking about. The trilemma is it's classic. Choose two of three. You choose the three corners are. He uses the terms nation state, democratic policy, and deep financial integration or something. But I'm going to use the terms rather. I like the terms better, which are national sovereignty, control over monetary policy, and globalization. And so on these three, he labels the three sides and says these are the sides that we have. Between national sovereignty and hyperglobalization, he calls it the golden straitjacket. Between national sovereignty and democratic policies, he calls it the Bretton Woods Compromise. And between hyperglobalization and democratic policies, he calls it global federalism or global governance, I'll call it. And so essentially what we had is in the golden straitjacket, that was the gold standard, right? Where basically you had, national sovereignty. Each nation had its own money system, but you still had the hyperglobalization because everything was pegged to the gold standard. And each country could still have its own local policies on things other than monetary policy. But, on monetary policy, you had no democratic control. Like if a government was in trouble for some reason, like, as an example, completely hypothetical example here, you just finished fighting a world war in your backyard and, you paid all your gold got shipped to the US to pay for all the war goods because, they had an entire industrial might and, you have no ability to manipulate your monetary system in order to, your debts to the U.S. were denominated in gold, and the U.S. was like insistent that you have to pay them in gold, and so you're in this golden straitjacket. You have no control over your monetary system.
Yeah, sure.
That's the golden straitjacket. After World War II, we realized, okay, this isn't going to work. What can we do
did that
instead?
Before? Yeah.
And that's that's what the whole book is about. It's like, okay, we were so insistent on remaining on the gold standard after World War I that eventually we couldn't sustain it, and Britain just had to break off the gold standard. All international trade stopped, and it led to the Great Depression, yada yada. So after World War II, near the end of it, we had this great meeting amongst everyone who comes together and says, okay, how do we figure out what to do? We can't go back to that golden straitjacket again. And you have two sides, essentially. You have, the most famous economist in the world, Keynes, on one side, and you had the Americans on the other side. The leader of the American side was this guy named Harry Dexter White. And so here's what Keynes's strategy. Here's what Keynes's plan was. It's called the Bancor plan. The Bancor plan basically
to clarify, is this what he called it, or is this what you've named it after in name of the Bancor Protocol?
No. He called it the Bancor plan. That was the name.
Cool. Okay, just
the Bancor Protocol named themselves after the Bancor plan, which I don't know why. I don't see it having any relationship whatsoever. But I'll describe Keynes's Bancor plan to you, and tell me if you see any linkage between.
Cool. Yeah, we'll do.
Protocol. So Bancor plan was basically this. He said, okay, we got to create a single, we still need a single global currency for world trade, but it can't be gold. We need to have that democratic policies and be able to manipulate it and stuff. So let's create a single global currency that is elastic in supply, and it's controlled by a global governance. And basically what we can do is the surplus nations after the war, the US, would have to lend to all the deficit nations, basically every other country, in order to help them, have money and stuff and
grow,
recover,
sure,
yeah. And so there would be a 3% loan. So on the side, the borrowers would have to pay 3% interest for how long they were lending it. But here's the fun part: the lenders also have to pay 3% interest as well. So this incentivizes them to spend their money in Europe, helping them to revitalize their economy. And the Americans were like, what? What the hell? Heck no. Why the hell would we're lending you money.
Why would they ever agree to that?
Yeah, they're like, what? You must be out of your mind. So they created the Americans instead proposed a system called the Bretton Woods Compromise, which is basically saying, okay, we'll still create a global currency called the SDR, special drawing rights, but we'll create a World Bank called the IMF. But similar to what Keynes wanted, but it's not going to be this elastic system at all. It's going to be very, very disciplinary, and SDRs would be backed by gold, mostly by gold, and partially a little bit by certain national currencies. But so that way, because it can be backed by national currencies a little bit, it gave the ability for other countries to, get some SDRs in their possession, because, they don't have any gold left. So at least now they can get some SDRs. And, here's your bonus to help you figure out how to revitalize this thing. And, that worked. But then, so it was still pretty disciplinary, and the U.S. had access to most of the SDRs. And it was the primary collateral for the SDR. So it's like gold, and next up is the US dollar.
Interesting.
Then, so, we have this hyper-disciplinary system. How does this help solve the problem of getting past the golden straitjacket? What we do then is we say, okay, look, the SDRs are disciplinary, but dollars are elastic. And so if we just all agree to settle all debts use dollars to denominate all debt, then the problem is solved, right? So, technically we're going to call SDRs the global currency, but really we're all going to agree now that we're going to all use, he called it gold-backed, Harry Dexter White, he called it, we're all going to use a gold-backed currency. And Keynes was out sick this day or something. So his junior partner who was there, he's like, oh, do you mean dollars? And Harry Dexter was like, yes, that'd be perfect. Yeah, let's write in dollars. Thing is, if Keynes was in the room, he would never have been okay with inscribing dollars as part of the agreement and stuff.
So effectively, these other countries, while not maybe on paper giving up the control over their own monetary policy, effectively did this by agreeing to dollars as
No, yeah. So, they basically said that, look, we're going to use dollars as the reserve currency instead of gold. And so what would happen is that essentially what it does is it turns the entire American economy into a bank for the rest of the world, where the entire banking system, and not even just the banking system, corporations and everything in the US, what they'll do is they'll accept foreign government debt in exchange for dollars. And so now the American dollar supply is actually elastic, because the banks in the US and stuff can create dollars that they can give to the other thing. But then, they get foreign government debt as the collateral.
Well,
and so SDR is disciplinary, but now American dollars became the world reserve currency, and they're relatively elastic.
That's crazy. You've convinced me of three things, maybe. The first one definitely is that I need to, take this goddamn course and learn a bit about the history of it, because it's so unbelievably relevant, and I've completely been ignoring it, at least as much as I'll say, if we care about cryptocurrencies being, money in some real sense. The second thing you convinced me of is that bananas are definitely money. There's no question here. 100%. Yeah. No way. So one point I want to make though.
Let me finish just the story.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, here was the implicit agreement that was okay, we're all gonna implicitly agree to this thing. Okay, so have you ever heard about here's my story about it. I was taking I took a lot of political economy classes when I was in school, right? And in it, we talked a little bit about when Nixon decided to go off the gold standard. And there was this talk about how we watched the speech that Nixon gave, and he was like, oh, it's because of these international speculators that were going off the gold standard and stuff. And my professor, who I also don't think knows that much about monetary history, he was like, oh, yeah, it's just this weird excuse that he gave. And he was just trying to all these bad policies that the government was doing. He was just trying to like throw it off onto international speculators. Where I don't know. I think he's kind of right. I think the speculator. I think Nixon was right in this case. So essentially the implicit agreement here was that everyone else is going to use these dollars, but you guys and dollars are technically convertible to gold. They're gold backed, but the idea was all these foreign countries shouldn't be ever trying to redeem their gold. You guys are all going to use dollars because we're letting you use our dollars. But, only Americans are supposed to be able to convert to gold. But then people found ways to how to redeem international dollars for gold. And that's when Nixon's like, whoa, because Fort Knox was just getting drained. Like the American gold supply was getting drained out because all these other foreigners were trying to withdraw American gold. And so that's when Nixon said, okay, no. Okay, we're cutting this off. We're cutting off the redeemability of dollars for gold, so that to prevent the gold supply from just like slipping out of the United States. And so that is the story. And then when that happened, when the dollar is no longer gold backed, every other country, said, wait, why are we pegging to the dollar still then? Because if it's not gold backed, the premise was that we were supposed to be pegged to the dollar because it was gold backed. And so we get into a period of floating exchange rates. And this is what led to the stagflation of the 80s, where no one was able to figure out all international trade stopped and everything because the currency exchange rates were just fluctuating like crazy. You couldn't make any long-term agreements. And we went through this period in the 80s, and then we basically kind of solved it a little bit in the 90s, where by the end of the 80s, where we came to this basically all the central bankers in the world figured out how to work together in order to combat this problem themselves. And so what they would do is they would basically say, they all basically followed this rule of inflation targeting, where they said, okay, look, earlier the premise of the central banks was in order to maintain convertibility. For the US, it was convertibility of dollars to gold, and for other banks, other central banks, it was convertibility of their national currency to dollars. Now we're all going to say, okay, we're all going to target inflation in our own country, hit it around that 2%. And if we're all just targeting the same roughly 2% inflation, this should relatively stabilize our prices with each other. And, it actually kind of reasonably worked, and that helped solve the stagflation. And it's all just because of central bank coordination.
So that was, first of all, this is crazy. This was a lovely history lesson. Thank you very much. But it seems like I didn't really understand what you meant at the beginning when you said in some sense, the system we have today evolved as it did at, reasonable steps in each case. And I totally hear, what you mean when you say that. But it seems to me like this is a very, very, obviously it's a very, very tough problem. And unlikely.
It's a trilemma. How do you solve a trilemma? I don't know if there's a solution to trilemmas.
Sharding, maybe, again, somehow sharding is relevant here. Probably.
Sharding solves it. Funny story about that. So okay, really quickly, just to put it back into that framing of that trilemma, right? Basically, what we're trying to figure out right now in the world is the Bretton Woods system. While the Bretton Woods system was active, there were heavy capital controls and free trade restrictions and stuff that just wasn't able to happen because, otherwise, if you allowed for, you could have if you didn't have capital controls, then countries could do crazy currency manipulation and stuff. And so you basically need to put a restriction on globalization. And globalization stopped because of these capital controls, trade restrictions, free floating exchange rates, which makes trade harder. You get limited globalization. Then in the 90s, a bunch of Europeans came together and said, hey, can we create a system that will allow us to, they created the euro. And the euro was basically saying that oh God, okay, let's go towards that global governance thing, or at least let's start off with European governance. And eventually, the Brexiteers are correct that the end goal of the euro, in order for it to succeed, Europe has to become a single country. You're going to lose out on that. The premise of that national governance is you're going to lose out on that national sovereignty.
Why couldn't it exist in this intermediate state where the currency is controlled by some international organization, but individual, sovereign nations still have some decision-making power?
Because Greece is not allowed to make individual decisions in order to like save itself from problems.
So a bit. The point about the trilemma, I guess, is that it's in some sense a continuum. Like you don't just have to be at any of the corners; you can exist somewhere at a point in the middle. You know what I mean? Like Greece isn't trading all of its sovereignty; it still, is Greece in some meaningful way, but it loses a little bit, right?
I think at some point it's going to have to. Why does the U.S. work as a single U.S. dollar? Is because the people in the rich states are willing to subsidize the people in the poorer states. Why are we willing to do this? Is because we're all American and we're willing to do that for our fellow.
Hell yeah, we are.
But is how currently the German is willing to do it for the Greek, but that's because Germans are just like riddled with guilt and it's very.
That's a hypothesis.
No, it's very interesting. We can talk about that later, but
sure.
How long are the Germans going to be willing to keep subsidizing the Greek economy? And, at some point, the Germans are going to say, no, okay, fine, we'll do this, but you got to implement these austerity measures and whatnot. And the Greeks are like, no, we don't want to. And, this is not a sustainable system. You either have nationalism to help solve this problem, and to inspire this sense of nationalism, we're going to have to give up on the national sovereignty eventually. And so the reason I talk about this euro thing is because, the designer of the euro, I actually forgot his name. I can't remember, but he basically said that he basically sees the long-term vision as it's going to be three currency areas. You're going to have the euro for all of Europe. You're going to have the dollar for all of the Americas, and by Americas it means like both North and South, and you're going to have yen be the currency for all of Asia, and you're going to have these three major currency zones, and we're going to get into this system of global governance with like three separate global governances. And he has basically I think he's turned against that at this point, and I think he's realized that actually maybe that's not actually that feasible. But what's the most interesting thing is this, we're getting a semi-global governance through central bank coordination. For example, the mutual inflation targeting, or here's another great example I really like. During the financial crisis, right? What happened was all the central bankers. Okay, so the ECB, all these shadow banks that were in Europe and stuff, they started collapsing and stuff, and so the ECB needed dollars. And so what the Fed did was they agreed to a swap with the ECB. And they basically said, okay, look, we'll trade you these many dollars for these many euros. And then at a later point in time, we're going to swap them back. And, when Bernanke was called into Congress to testify about this, he was asked wait a second, aren't we just going to be how can we? A swap has to have costs. If the two currencies fluctuate against each other, they're going to have costs. Someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And Bernanke is like, well, you see, we do our books in dollars and the ECB does their books in euros. So technically, no one's going to lose because we're both going to get. We're going to get back the exact amount of dollars that we lent out, and they're going to get back the exact amount of euros that they lent out. And it was basically these central bankers are coordinating, going kind of a little bit over the heads of the governments themselves.
So this is the question, right?
Yeah.
How much is this central bank coordination actually democratic sovereign control of yourself? You know what I mean? In some sense, the central bankers aren't, at least in our case, elected officials. My question is how much are they really?
At least the chairman of the Fed is appointed by the president.
Fair enough, but I get, and this relates to a question that I wanted to ask actually about Libra, which is that how do we think about these trade-offs in the context of non-sovereign governments, like institutions and corporations, kind of making these decisions?
Right. So Libra is kind of part of one of many things that have set me down this road of discovery.
Apparently, my God, you're so full of information. It's actually shocking. Like more than anything, the number of names that you've remembered, I'm wildly impressed by. I will say.
Yeah, the book. Read the book, by the way. It's a really good book.
I'm totally gonna. Yeah. This is, oh my God, you could not have changed. Do you remember when we went on that consensus retreat? You were like, oh my God, Bitcoin replaces banking. You are your own bank.
Yeah, I think I was brainwashed. I think these crypto people were brainwashing us, man.
Dude, dude, you were the one who brainwashed me, so don't even try.
I know.
Bro, I gotta learn so much history.
Me too. I don't know.
Yeah, but you at least know the word. You at least know what Bretton Woods means. Like, I'm like, oh, the woods in Bretton? I'd have heard of it.
So I guess Libra, it was really funny when David Marcus was like testifying to Congress. He was like, oh, this is no way meant to be a threat to the US dollar. We're not competing with the US dollar. And then like an hour after he finished his testimony, like the Libra Twitter account tweets out like, we're building a new blockchain central bank. And it was like, oh.
They didn't watch, I guess.
Yeah. Some intern just got fired, I bet. So it's like, that it's so there's no information on what Libra is doing. They want to create a blockchain central bank. Okay. And then, there's not.
So what do you mean? Do you mean like future strategy goals, or what they're going to back their Libra with, or like what specifically do you mean?
They claim they're going to back it with a basket of national currencies.
Right. Yeah.
And issue a Libra. I don't know what to call it. It's just a Libra. It's not like it's pegged to the dollar. It's just it's kind of more like SDR, if anything. And they assume that they have such a wide distribution that they can. Yeah. But essentially going down this path, what I've been thinking to myself is, okay, if this Bitcoin stuff is not useful, or this Ethereum DeFi stuff is not useful, at least in its current state, what is useful from this blockchain technology? And, how can Libra, if they choose to be benevolent, I don't know if they're going to be a benevolent or a good or negative force in the space, we'll see. But if they're negative, how does anyone, create a good alternative? How can we improve the system? Like, I got into Bitcoin because I thought I understood the system, and I guess it turns out I had a very cursory view, and I only heard about all the negatives when I didn't get taught about the positives of the system that exists as is.
Yeah.
And how can we? So let's say this discipline elasticity maybe becomes a little bit too elastic right now. The Bitcoin solution is just like shoved down on the discipline. That's probably not the right solution, right? The other, like 2 weeks ago, Pomp had this newsletter that got sent out, and he's like, Bitcoin is smarter than the central bankers. And I'm like,
yeah,
that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Given that it literally doesn't make any changes from the initial thing, it seems unlikely that it's smarter than people who are like, have real information.
Right. So, maybe the central bankers are making a bunch of decisions, and maybe, they make wrong decisions sometimes.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to bet that on net, they probably make better decisions than not making any decisions at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my question is, how can we improve the current system? And what I've been trying to do is, by going down this journey, I've been trying to figure out, okay, what are specific examples of things we could do in order to help the system be better? Okay, maybe I can just list out to you or explain some of my ideas that I've been thinking about.
Before you do, I would want to say that like my first reaction to that question is that, so it seems unlikely that, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are as to like where we can improve. But the point also I would make is that this is also a very compelling argument for like competition. This is an argument for a multi-token future where there are, 17 different competing monies that, one is Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin really is so much worse, which I think you're probably right, that like, given that it's making no decisions, it's probably not the best thing in the world. One of them is Bitcoin. On the other end, maybe is like, what we have today. But the whole spectrum should be explored. And I think through competition, we'll probably likely be able to find, what the balance is between, elasticity and what's the other one?
Discipline.
That's the one. Yeah. So but what do you think? Like, what can be approved?
So I do want to get back to that question about the multi-currency world. And this is what I've been thinking about lately. And by lately, I mean in like the last day or two, and kind of go down this path. And so I'll get to what I'm thinking about that. But let's approach it right now from someone appointed me to be a special advisor to the Fed, and I get to tell them like, here's my, I'm somewhat knowledgeable about cryptocurrencies and blockchains and stuff and what they're useful for. What can we do to help the system? So, here's like a crazy idea. I don't know how feasible this one is, but it's like, what if, to Pomp's point that maybe we don't make perfect decisions, what if if you assume that the wisdom of the crowd is somewhat useful, what if we use like prediction markets to help guide monetary decision? I don't like futarchy in saying it decides monetary policy, but I think using it to gather information and collect here's a controversial opinion. We don't pay our public officials enough. We should be paying them way more. In Singapore, they do that. In Singapore, the government officials are some of the best paid people. And let's say you're the best banker in the world. You have such a sharp economic mind. Are you going to go work at JP Morgan, or are you going to go work at the Fed? You're probably going to go work at JP Morgan because you're going to get a ton of more money there. So, I don't think we're paying our central bankers enough, or even our public officials in general. But can prediction markets be used as a way to incentivize the best economists in the world to make better decisions and put essentially skin in the game next to their policy recommendations that they make?
Interesting. So I would say if I was in that same position, which God, I hope I never am in a position of making any recommendations to the Fed about anything, but if I ever happen to be, what do you think about literally just putting the US dollar on the blockchain? Like, what do you think about?
I think that's absolutely awesome. That's great. That's what we want to do.
Me too. I think that God damn it. I always end up arguing for Cosmos, which is totally not my goal. But interoperability and being able to, use these assets in a meaningful way in the crypto space, not just, there's something that's worth about $1, but actually having $1 on the blockchain seems like, an amazing step forward in enabling a real competition to find what good money is.
Yep. And once you have it on a blockchain, there's a lot of benefits you can get, even if it's essentially issued currency like $1, which, by the way, the dollar is not essentially issued, but for one, what's useful? Privacy is still useful. Even if we have centrally issued stuff, the technology of ZK snarks and Zcash and stuff is still useful regardless of the nature of the assets. So that's one thing. But here's an example of something that I think that could be cool. Like, it's a very specific example, but it's kind of like an example of the things I've been trying to figure out. Do you know the difference between contemporaneous reserve accounting and lagged reserve accounting?
Absolutely not. I 100% never know the difference between them.
Okay. So here's what the difference is. What the Fed currently does is something called lagged reserve accounting. So you know how we have a reserve requirement, right? Let's say it's 10%. Okay.
Sorry, can I guess? Can I guess here? Can I jump the gun? So pretty much at the end of the period, they have to have the reserve ratio, but they don't necessarily have to have it in the interim of the period. Contemporaneous insists that the reserve ratio is true at any point in time.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically at every 2 weeks, the Fed checks, okay, you have to have the reserve of the average of your outstanding deposits over the last 2 weeks. And then what will happen is the banks are basically lending freely, and come the checkpoint time, the Fed doesn't want the banks to default, so it's kind of forced to lend to them, and actually, so they can meet their reserve requirement. And so the reserve requirement's functionally not doing much. They tried contemporaneous reserve accounting back in I think the 70s or 80s under Volcker, and during that time, it was an accounting nightmare. They couldn't do it. Like they couldn't match the books at the banks with the books at the Fed, and they couldn't do it. But the technology probably just wasn't ready at the time. I think with a blockchain system, maybe we can do that. And that's
it seems easy. It seems easier.
Yeah. This is like the blog Marginal Revolution.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, so it's like, small steps towards a better world. Like,
yeah.
Let's not shove that discipline. Let's like, okay, maybe that's a little better disciplinary, and like maybe we can rebalance the system like that.
Yeah. No, I think there's definitely, just like that, I think there's probably a bunch of other areas where just like sticking it on a blockchain, you get a win because it's a technology upgrade. Although I will say the other thing that you have to do to convince, say, a central government to do this would be to tell them that the negatives that they've heard about blockchains aren't necessarily, as debilitating as they might seem. Like, DK snarks are great and privacy is great, except of course, central governments don't always optimize for privacy, right, of their citizens, right? And so one thing that could be interesting is that if you could design some smart contract system that functioned, let's say, very similarly to how, how to say this? Imagine that to use this smart contract, you need to get KYC'd by the government first, for example. And at any point in time, they could freeze your account if they went through the proper legal procedure, right? Obviously, coming from a crypto perspective, it's not ideal. Like, I'm sure a lot of people in the space wouldn't identify with it, but realistically, it would be a step much closer to achieving this goal of getting the US dollar on the blockchain. And so I
agree.
Yeah.
I think that's completely okay. Yeah. I think that I'm willing to make those sacrifices. It's not sacrifices because, the alternative is that none of this stuff gets adopted anyway.
Exactly.
So we're in no better role.
It seems like you could, from an ideological perspective, say, oh, how could we do that? It's compromising all of our morals. But the point here is that it probably is better than the status quo and better than where the status quo is going anyways. So it's like, just from a pragmatist perspective, it might be better. Yeah.
Yep.
Totally fair.
The other interesting thing I'm really interested in is Ethan Buckman. He does a great talk about this tool called Bean Count, which is just like it's like I use it for all my accounting. It's like it's plain text accounting. It's really cool. But he has this grand vision about finance. This tool will allow like all companies and corporations to be like easily inspectable and auditable. And so this is one thing I think blockchains can actually be really useful for. So what blockchains give you is this transparency and inspectability. I think part of the issue with the financial crisis in 2008 and why it blew up to such magnificent proportions is because of had these like CDS squareds that were like side bets on a CDS that was backed by this security that itself was packaged up like a bunch of other mortgage-backed securities. And you have these like crazy things, and like you're holding a financial instrument and you just don't know what the risk profile of this instrument actually is because there's just so much opacity underlying it. Now, maybe with a blockchain, we can help solve that, where even if we have under-collateralized systems and stuff, which, that's how finance has to be, but maybe we can have systems that are at least more easily inspectable. So I'm getting this like, a share from a money mutual fund, and it's like at least I can see what's collateralizing this thing all the way down to the bottom, and that seems useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. So like transparency is very interesting.
I like the term inspectability. That's, I think, the term I've been trying to use.
Yeah. Or even accountability in some sense, like because it's not necessarily that you want to be able to see you don't necessarily want to be able to see every single house that is in this mortgage that makes up this mortgage-backed security, but you might want to be convinced that they are in fact reasonable mortgages that aren't all going to default, right? So totally hear you. The one thing I'd push back on is, though I think a lot of people argue for this in the blockchain space, I don't actually think our blockchains accomplish this in any meaningful way. Like, let's look at Ethereum, for example. Accounting, transparency. You're a user, you want to see all the transactions your account has been involved in. I mean, you've got two options. The first one is you go and look at Etherscan, and the second one is you say, shit, I can't do that, right? Like, it's not actually feasibly possible to, in a decentralized manner, go and look at all the transactions your account has been involved in. So I hear you, but I would argue that a lot of people say that, and most of the time it's just talk. People just say, "Oh, accountability, yay, you can see everything," but you can't actually see anything because there's so much goddamn data floating around.
So let's design systems that are better and
Yes.
focused on more focused. I think right now all of the systems that we are designing right now in Ethereum are designed. How do we pump the price of ETH? Because that's what we're focusing on. But
No
let's design
way.
systems that are actually designed for inspectability. Let's make that our prime goal, our prime directive, and figure out how we can design systems to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think designing, there's like when you're designing a new blockchain or a new protocol, like keeping in mind like accountability and transparency and auditability is like something that is super, super underrated as of current, and like pretty much doesn't happen and is like, totally essential.
Yeah. So I don't know. This is the path that I'm going down. What are blockchains actually useful for in a world in which Bitcoin doesn't exist? I'm becoming one of those,
Oh, no.
I'm becoming one of those blockchain, not Bitcoin people.
That's amazing. This is really crazy because this is such like, it's definitely a massive difference from like 2 years ago when you were all, Bitcoin replaces banking. It was like, you were the first person to ever say that to me,
Yeah. I was explaining this to the Contemporaneous versus lag thing to Brian, Fabian Crane, and Mahir. And so, I was explaining to this, and then at the end, they were just laughing because they were like, Sonny, when we met you 3 years ago, you were talking about how Bitcoin is going to destroy all the banks and everything. And now you're telling us how blockchain is going to change the accounting system that the Federal Reserve uses.
Yeah, you definitely changed the tone. Is this just a result of this like extra, the things that you've learned? Was it literally just that you didn't know what the Fed did and why it did what it did, and now you do, and so you changed your mind? Or were there other things that kind of informed you to kind of change your opinion in such a dramatic way?
I'm actually being paid by the FBI to spread.
Dude, that makes both of us. Thank God you admitted it first.
I don't know. I think it was learning stuff. Have you heard of a blog called Epsilon Theory?
No, never.
Great blog. I'll send you some links to all of our listeners. Check it out. Sometimes I forget we're actually recording a podcast. And yeah, so. Yeah, Epsilon Theory. I think he has some great posts where he explains the metagame of what we're doing, and let's not make some metagame fails. Let's see how we can actually try to create positive change for the world and not just die on a hill.
Yeah, totally.
And yeah, so I think it's a combination of a couple of different things. The Libra stuff has definitely got me way more interested in like at least pointing out to me that look, there's at least a more urgent need for trying to help solve some of these problems.
Yeah. So real quick, you mentioned earlier, and we forgot to return to it, is how all of this stuff relates to a multi-token world.
Yeah. So here's my question. So what I'm I'm actually trying to read a little bit more Hayek now, which I haven't done. So I think Bitcoiners often misunderstand Hayek, where they think that Hayek is like saying like we're gonna have a single Hayek specifically talked about how we're going to have a marketplace of currencies that are all competing with each other, and whoever provides the best currency will dominate the market. And if you approach it like that, saying Bitcoin is the best currency, then maybe, but I don't know if it's the best currency or not. So
interestingly, I would say I know a single thing about Hayek, and it's just this argument because you've mentioned it, and I read about it as a result. But the point he makes essentially is the best currency is going to be the one that is stable. That's like the point that he makes. And in that sense, like if the point is, Bitcoin is the best currency, and Hayek says that, this is the case, in some sense, they're definitely missing the point there.
Yeah. He thinks it's going to be the one that's the most stable, not the one that rises in value the fastest?
No, absolutely. He argues is like a key point of money. And one of the main goals of these issuers of these monies is essentially to provide stability of the money. And he gives some definition of what stability is, which is like if you pick a random asset, it's equally likely to go up or down compared to the predictions. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, like I said, I'll admit I haven't read enough Hayek or barely any Hayek. I read a little bit back when I was in school for some classes. Been a while. And you know how school reading is. I skim it.
Trust me, I know.
So here's my question. Here's what I'm trying to think. How I'm trying to position. How I'm thinking about it. Where does that world fall in that Rodrik's trilemma? You know what I mean? I don't know where it
Yeah.
falls in that. And does it? So I guess here's my question: is if you had a system in which anyone could use any currency. So here here, just heads up, my thoughts here are way less fleshed out than some.
No worries, man. Me too.
So if you have a system in which anyone can use any currency, this is the world of Interledger. This is why I think Interledger is a very interesting project for many reasons. But if I could use any different currency to pay anyone, will everyone shift only towards one currency or the dominant currency? And will that actually lose out on the ability to do any sort of national monetary policy to improve one's local economy? It seems that is a world of many currencies actually just it's definitely not the Bretton Woods system. I feel that. Okay, so I guess this takes a very charterless point of view, but like why are okay in the national currency system, or pre this world, right? Pre-internet. Why are national currencies valued? Why doesn't everyone just use the best, soundest national currency, right? Well, why doesn't everyone just use the British pound, or why doesn't everyone just use the dollars? Might have been because it's just hard to, because all that's your entire economy locally is based off of the franc or something, right? The French franc.
Well, it seems to me the argument is probably more. I bet the argument is probably less about how hard it is to switch and switching costs, rather than like the benefit that you get from having a national currency, as you say, is this sovereignty over said currency, right?
No, but I guess my point is, why do the people I guess my question, in a country whose currency is failing,
yeah,
why do people continue to use that currency?
I mean, I don't think they always do. Like,
always flock to the sounder currency.
I mean, I think that totally happens, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Well, no, it doesn't. Historically, I'd say it doesn't, because there was a massive physical cost where money wasn't digital, and actually using your money, another system, it was really hard. But today, it's because of capital controls. Like, why don't the people in Venezuela just use dollars for everything? It's because it's illegal to do so.
Yeah, fair.
They're not allowed to.
Totally. So, but I mean, there have been historical instances of, I think in Zimbabwe, for example. I'm undereducated on the situation, but there was a switch that was made at some point. And I think you're totally right that the switching costs usually are in the form of legislation saying you better not take your money out of this goddamn currency or we'll get you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my question is, though, here then, in this multi-currency world, are governments allowed to implement capital controls in order to maintain their ability to do sovereign monetary policy? Because if anyone can use any currency easily, they kind of lose out on a lot of that capabilities.
Yeah.
Especially when, and then also, if they're not allowed to commit to do capital controls, maybe they can still influence it because they still require that tax. This is very charterless, but maybe it's because they require that taxes are still paid to them in their national currency, and you're not allowed to pay taxes and everything and anything else. But then it gets into then we get into a whole rabbit hole of what right does government have to tax citizens, and
oh god,
is this extortion that we're forcing you to buy our thing so that we can force you to pay our taxes in it and stuff? It's it gets into a very messy rabbit hole, and that's where I haven't started down that rabbit hole yet. What does a world of Hayekian currency look like, and its impact on how taxation works and how national monetary policy works and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, yeah, absolutely fair. And one question that this raises is so I've always thought about like, the question of, why would government choose to regulate cryptocurrencies or blockchains? I've always thought of like, there's going to be an assassination market, there's going to be a murder DAO, and it might turn out that the reason that like any regulatory attention at all, and we really haven't seen very many of those, in the wild on these blockchains, it might turn out that the reason that, the government chooses to regulate these cryptocurrencies and these blockchains is because it makes the market for money too competitive, and governments simply can't compete.
Right.
Which would be crazy. It would be a shocking outcome.
Yeah, speaking of that, the blog I mentioned earlier, Epsilon Theory, it's by this guy Ben Hunt, and he's an investor, but he has this great quote that he often likes to refer to, and he puts it oftentimes in his thing. And I was very confused as to what it meant, but I finally found the one post where he finally actually explains it properly. And so he has this quote, says, it's called render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And so, here's the story behind it. He tells this story about like, I think it's a biblical story or something, where people are like, a bunch of people go to Jesus and ask him like, hey, like, is it lawful to pay our taxes to Caesar? Should we pay them or should we not? Sensing the metagame fail by refusing to pay taxes, and that Caesar will just come in and destroy the entire like movement that he's creating, he basically says like, look at the coin, whose likeness and inscription is on the coins. And they said, well, Caesar's face is on the coins. And so then Jesus is like, well, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God everything else. And he's basically, Ben's point here is he's basically making this claim that like, look, the single like primary thing of government, as the whole reason this entire government thing exists is like, it is supposed to do this, deal with this money thing. And if we try to attack that one thing that they are supposed to be, that they hold more sacred than anything else, they're going to come down on us, like, and it's going to be very scary. And we're just going to lose. There's no doubt about it. We're going to lose it. We're going to lose the battle. And so he's saying like, okay, let's just look at the, metagame here and see what are more strategic, like, Ben, he's like, I am on the same side as you guys. I believe in individual liberty and like, he calls himself a liberal.
I guess his point, and let me guess, his point essentially is that the way to get there isn't necessarily coming out and saying Bitcoin is going to replace the US dollar in every way, and then we won't pay taxes and we'll be completely private, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like that might not be the narrative that best gets us to our goal.
Right. And we're just going to piss off the government, and they're going to crack down on us. And, I think we're seeing it today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Libra hearings are like, prime example of that happening.
Exactly. And, I think he has a point here where let's figure out let's be a little bit more subtle about what we're doing. Let's be smarter than just like going in guns blazing.
Yeah. But it's so fun to just be a maximalist for cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Run in and say, screw the banks, screw everything.
Yeah. It's fun to play revolutionary.
Yeah, it really is. And it also, I think almost always, it's not as effective as if, you really figure out what your goals are and work more actively towards them. I think that's totally fair. Yeah. Is he a crypto guy? I've never heard of him before.
He's a crypto skeptic. Like, he has some articles on Bitcoin. It's not like he's unaware. He just is like, yeah, this is dumb, bad idea, guys.
Who is he? What is his history? Do you know?
He's just an investor. Like an
Ben
investor.
Hunt. Yeah. Oh, he's old. He looks smart. Anyone who's old and has a blog is automatically smart, definitely. Because otherwise they would have stopped blogging by then.
Yeah.
On the Libra stuff, though, there is another possibility, though. Mm-hmm. It's possible. So it seems like two things can happen, right? Either like cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum will get grouped with Libra from like a regulatory perspective, or they won't. Yeah. And that regulators will think about cryptocurrencies as like Libra and Bitcoin and Ethereum, or there's Libra, which is like the good one, one of them, and then there's also these like super decentralized ones like Bitcoin and Ethereum. And I think in either case, like given the pushback that we're seeing from the government, things don't look good for Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? In the case where it's grouped with Libra, Libra is obviously already getting pushback from the government. It doesn't look good for Bitcoin and Ethereum. In the case where Bitcoin and Ethereum aren't grouped with Libra, I mean, they're even worse. I mean, it's not like, because at least you can go call Facebook in and talk to them. It's not like you can call anyone in and talk to them about Bitcoin and say, hey, stop that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And like the big people think that, oh, how is the government going to stop Bitcoin and stuff? It's easy. They're going to arrest anyone who has Bitcoin. It's not like they haven't done stuff like this before.
Yeah, I wonder if that would be the outcome. I personally bet it would be like, attack the exchanges and stop anyone from being able to actually effectively get these things. That seems like a much easier strategy.
Yeah, and maybe you can do a buyback of all Bitcoin where it will say, okay, turn in your Bitcoin. This is being, we're nationalizing Bitcoin now, and turn in your Bitcoin to the state, and we'll pay you, we'll compensate you for your Bitcoin.
$1 million per Bitcoin, right? That's the exchange rate, I'm sure.
I feel like if that happened, the Bitcoiners would be like, all right, we'll take it. Not a bad return.
Yeah, fine. We'll accept it. We didn't like decentralization that much.
How much do you think Bitcoiners are willing to like sell out for?
Oh, that is a great question. Okay, so if we said like, we'll give you $1 million, like if you were sure that Bitcoin was never going above $1 million and you said, I'll give you $1 million for your Bitcoin right now. I mean, I might accept. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how much I care about decentralization. Like I say I do, but if someone offered me the cash, who knows,
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, did I, through the course of this discussion, successfully turn you into a fiat shill?
Maybe. Here's what I'll say. You convinced me that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, and I absolutely need to like learn more about practically what the Fed does, what the Fed did, and why it does what it does today. And also, I'm definitely convinced, even more than I was before, that Bitcoin and Ethereum are not in any real meaningful sense good money, and probably never will be, as long as they stick with their current ethos of like, here's the supply, and that's what it is.
Yeah, and I'm worried about what happens, and I feel we just need to figure out what happens in this Hayekian world, because I think the Hayekian system
of competing currencies. What is the outcome? First of all, is it likely that there's going to be a dominant winner? If there's not, what is the distribution going to look like, and what are the effects on everyone? Is a very important question. Yeah,
and also, are nation states going to be amenable to this? And if they're not, what does that look like? How do they fight it? And what impact does that have?
Yeah. Wow.
These are the questions that we should learn. Yeah.
Good questions. Cool stuff.
So yeah, Rodrik's Trilemma. Think about it. That's the Trilemma. Screw this like scaling Trilemma. That's all easy.
No, come on, dude.
This is the real Trilemma.
Yeah, that's easy technical challenges. The rest is like actually hard stuff where you have to deal with people,
Exactly.
Fair enough.
All right. Well, I hope I got you some stuff to think about, and hopefully our listeners as well.
I'm sure it's not possible not to think about something after that one. So thanks again. That was super interesting.
Yep. Cool. See you. Bye.
See ya. Hayek, you're such a cool guy. Sonny loves you so much. Yeah, you think if you saw Hayek on the street, you'd kiss him on his cheek?